let's spend some time on these on this topic of bias and stereotypes. So I think all of these generative, I mean, we have seen a lot of work to show that these generative AI models are biased. So what is your take on first these bias and stereotypes of these models, and second, if one has to develop more responsible AI systems, what should one do? How should one go about doing? And if you have any ideas even about cultural biases that these systems have, throw some light on it.
Yeah. So again, not exactly my area, but I do have opinions. And so I think
No, I think your tweets give away the thing of you have opinion on many things. So yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I think LMs have deeply ingrained bias, and it's all of the ones that you would expect. Basically, it's I think they're racist, they're sexist, they're heteronormative, they're culturally aligned with sort of Western values and the U.S. and stuff like this. They're also, an important thing to recognize is that they're a little bit behind the times, right? Because a lot of the training data is
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
past and
yeah.
sometimes even the distant past. So I think these are all known problems, and basically ableist is another one. Any kind of bias that you can imagine, that exists in society is going to be reflected in an LLM. And then the question is, how effectively can we mitigate those biases? And I think, like, to some extent, the jury is still out, but I think there's a lot of evidence that, like the general issue, like the general topic of like safety mechanisms or safety fine tuning. It's really superficial, like what people accomplish usually with these kinds of interventions. And so we were thinking of doing some of this work, but I think there's been a few papers that do similar things right now. So the kind of work is looking at a system that has been trained to not exhibit bias, and showing that it still has those biases ingrained at a deeper level. So this is like the idea of implicit bias, which is popular in psychology. So, um, even if you don't like say racist things, you might still behave in a racist manner. You might still have those racist beliefs deep down, and similar for other biases. So I think a lot of the training right now, what it's really doing is it's teaching systems to be politically correct. So to like say the right things, but it's not really changing the fact that they have these biases deep down. And this becomes a problem when you put them in decision-making situations. So when you turn them into agents or assistants, I think these biases will again surface and be reflected in the decisions that they make and the actions that they take in a very subtle and diffuse way sometimes. And so some of these works that I mentioned, for instance, they give some demonstrations of things like that. And then they also demonstrate that when you ask the system, for instance, why did you prefer this resume over that one? It'll make up some bullshit excuse that has nothing to do with the actual reasons. You have like two resumes that are exactly the same, except they differ in terms of one attribute, like let's say sex. And then it'll say like, oh yeah, the man is a better candidate because they seem to have more leadership experience. And that's just bullshit because they don't have more leadership experience. The only difference is that they're a man. And so, I think we have sort of successfully figured out how to train these systems to hide their biases, but not to actually get rid of the bias.
Yeah. Following up on these biases itself, right? In case of fatal mistakes committed by even the example that you just now said, I think we've seen some companies where these recruitment software that was used had some bias, and therefore they were recruiting people with biases itself. If these mistakes are made, how do we decide who is responsible for these mistakes, right? How can we penalize in order to maintain some level of law and order and things like that?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting. Let me see if I can remember, because this was also one of the things that came up in terms of the legal challenges at FACT. People were working on this, and um, I think a big issue that they were facing. So there were like two big issues they were facing. So they were again looking at the use of AI in employment and employment screening, and one big issue is that there's just a lack of transparency. So usually, if you don't get an interview or you don't get hired for a job, you don't know why. You don't know if they even
Yeah,
used AI at all to make that decision.
yeah,
The other one was that a lot of the laws in place, I think including some new laws, but also like existing employment law, really only allows you to go after the employer and not after the provider of the software. And that's a big problem. So I think, generally speaking, I think at least in the current landscape, I'm in favor of holding developers accountable for a lot of things, because I think they are just the natural point of intervention. And especially when we're talking about these really big and powerful tech companies, I think they, it just makes sense to hold them to a high standard. That being said, I think, and we talk about this some in the 175-page report I mentioned earlier in the socio-technical section, there's opportunities for governance like everywhere in the stack. So there's sort of the means of production itself, like the compute and the data and the talent, and then there's the development, and then there's the deployment, and then there's the use. And I think it's still, we're still figuring out where responsibility should be assigned along, these four different sort of parts of the AI pipeline. But I think a lot of the time, the only effective governance interventions are going to be further up the stack, so more at the level of developers, or even the means of production, like the data or the compute. And that might be sometimes at odds with how regulation often works, or how similar, superficially similar cases have been handled in the past. But I think it's might be necessary, just from a practical point of view, to to look at like the developers more and less at the use cases. So a lot of people say we should just govern the use cases. Just if somebody misuses an AI system, hold them accountable. And I think a big problem with that is that it just puts way too much onus on the user. So again, there's going to be, like in the case with AI assistants, there's just going to be all these cases where it's really hard to resist using AI systems, because they provide such a competitive advantage, at least in the short term. And so you feel like, oh, we just have to use this system, and we don't even know how it works, or maybe we know that there's some problems with it, but like our business is going to fail if we don't start adopting AI. Like this is, I think, a lot of businesses right now are probably scrambling to adopt AI because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they've yeah. And so I think it doesn't make sense to hold them responsible in that case, because just they don't really have a meaningful choice a lot of the time. So I think if you want to be effective, you'll have to say, no, it's going to be the developers or deployers who need to have more of the responsibility here.
Yeah. But as an employee, David, if you think about it, applying for a job, I don't even have access to what services or products that they're using, right? I know only that I applied to the company A for a job. Other than making that company accountable, what choice do I have?
Yeah, so we need more regulation there, I think, is
Hmm.
the short answer. So yeah, I think there was a recent law in New York State that was trying to do this, that was just did a really bad job at the end of the day. So like, it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion about AI regulation now, and a lot of it is focused on like these, dangerous capabilities and these sort of like catastrophic risks. But I think a lot of the actual opportunity to make progress right now is way more like at the ground level, nitty gritty stuff, like, in employment, for instance, where we need effective laws that give job seekers more information about how AI was used to process their case.
Okay, let's take a detour to this whole resources business. So these models require a lot of hardware and maintenance of the system, right? So and they need huge amounts of silicon, GPUs, and everything like that. Shouldn't the so you mentioned about climate change as a topic before. Shouldn't environmental responsibility also be discussed, important topic as part of AI safety itself? If so, what is being discussed? What are the current trends in this discussion?
Yeah, so this is something that people have been talking about for a while, and historically I've been like kind of skeptical of this angle on AI, but I'm definitely it's something I'm thinking about a lot more right now, and I don't have actually it's one area where I don't have super strong opinions at the moment. I think like the argument in my mind was always, well, yeah, we know that like climate change is an issue, and we should just tackle that as an issue itself. So like, whether or not you're using energy to like fly a plane, or make food, or make AI, that's kind of it doesn't really matter. The point is you're using the energy, and the question is it clean energy, or if you're creating emissions that are harming the environment and harming other people, is that being accounted for properly, and are we doing a good job of like fairly distributing the sort of the harms and externalities, which of course we aren't. I mean, rich countries pollute way more, and that's huge historical injustice that needs to be accounted for and rectified somehow. Um, but yeah, but now it's like it's getting to the point where I think energy is just actually becoming a plausible bottleneck for building more and more powerful AI systems. And so you have uh, the big companies sort of trying to set up sweetheart deals with governments to get privileged access to power. And I think I've also heard that just like the cooling of data centers
Yeah,
is
yeah,
sometimes depriving communities of water that they need, to survive, basically. And so I think it makes total sense to like organize against those kinds of trends. And um, yeah, I don't know if like uh, specific regulation would be called for that would be specific to AI versus just specific to like big energy projects, period. Um,
hmm
but it does seem like this is a real important live issue and will increasingly be so in the future as the energy use continues to rise.
yeah.
But yeah, that's about all I have to say about it.
Sure, sure. So let's go to again somebody who's super active on Twitter, Jan LeCun, right? So he has I mean, views on many things. One of the as part of the summer school, also we watched his podcast with Lex Friedman, where he talks about a lot of the work that they had done before and how this text, which is mostly what even now I think we've been referring to, is very limited, whereas the vision and multimodal is what the future is. So, what are your thoughts around that, and what do you see the future as in terms of multimodal? But we can keep the discussion specifically around AI safety itself.
Yeah. So I've been really impressed by what's possible from training just on text. I was always a big believer in scaling up deep learning. I'm not like a scale maximalist. I think there's more to it than that, but I think scaling up deep learning is super powerful, and I thought that since I got into the field, basically. But one thing I missed is sort of the specialness of text. So I think text just gives you a lot more like bang for your buck in terms of um, how information dense it is. Um, so in that sense, I think text is really, really valuable, and to some extent, the multimodality is maybe looks less important to me now than I would have thought several years ago.
Oh, okay.
Um, on the other hand, I think it is it is a crucial component for AGI as I've described it. Like if you have a system that can't process certain data modalities that humans are able to process, then that's a qualitative cognitive deficit compared to humans, and therefore that system is not AGI. And yeah, so I think yeah, modal capabilities, so to speak, will be important. It's a little bit less clear whether these other modalities, how important other modalities will be in terms of giving systems sort of the general understanding of how the world works and sort of reasoning capabilities and stuff like this. I can imagine that almost all of that can come just from training on language. I think multimodal is still important and is still somewhat lacking, even though we do see, models incorporating uh, audio and images as well. But yeah, I think it's a little bit still a pretty big unknown.
Sure.
So I wouldn't have
Yeah.
like super confident predictions there.
Okay.
I would say, yeah, just that we do need to have those capabilities to deal with all the same modalities that humans can deal with in order for a system to qualify as AGI. And I think that's important because as long as there are things that humans are better at, we will not all lose our jobs, and we will maintain some ability to potentially have power over these systems.
Sure. Let's take next couple of questions, lighter ones, not necessarily the
Right.
technical side. As an undergrad student, most of the participants in this program are undergrad students. If I were to sort of say build a research career in AI safety, where should I start? How should I go about doing things? What are your suggestions, pointers?
Yeah, I think it's not too different from, research in machine learning more broadly. I think it's increasingly becoming just, another area of machine learning to a large extent. On the other hand, there is still sort of a separate intellectual community, the AI safety community, you could call it, that overlaps with academia, but also exists within companies and also exists on like internet fora, like the Alignment Forum. And I think it's useful to at least have some awareness of all three of these areas if you're working in AI safety. Um, I also think that it's always been the case that this field is too focused on technical research, and that's actually the case in machine learning in general. I think machine learning is, as a field, is like not it's like not quite connected enough to like the practical day-to-day realities. So like people are usually not trying to really think seriously about the social impact of the technology they're building. They're sort of like, the more common attitude I've encountered is just, science is good, progress is good. I you know I make systems that do stuff like, do a better job on this benchmark, or solve some new contrived
Yeah.
task, and it's up to the rest of the world to figure out the implications of that. So I definitely reject that mindset. I think especially if you are serious about the problem of AI safety, you need to think much more seriously about the social impact of your work, and like sort of think about this all as a socio-technical problem. So concretely, what that means is to be more, to actually spend time thinking about that, and to talk to people who are involved, on the ground, seeing how AI is deployed and how it's, so the safety issues and the societal issues around that. And then also, I think just think outside the box in terms of what you do with your career. So, there's so many people who are just trying to do like technical safety or alignment research right now, and so few in my experience who are trying to do things like work with the rest of the world, work with like civil society, work with governments. And so I think like getting involved in government or in other NGOs and stuff like this, is really neglected. So I think doing that kind of work and starting to do it early, and building networks, and thinking about you know what how you can actually translate your work into measurable, meaningful, real world impact very quickly, um, is really worth doing. It's something that I actually sort of regret not doing more of earlier in my career. Um, so like, FACT is a pretty good conference for this sort of stuff. And last year is the first time that I went. I think, I wasn't publishing there. So when I was a grad student, I wouldn't have gotten funded, and I probably would have gone earlier, but there was the pandemic. But yeah, I think, think about like, a lot of the times people ask me like, do you work on any particular applications? And I've always said, no, I just do like, core machine learning, like deep learning, just, and I was never that interested in like sort of the traditional application areas like NLP or vision or whatever. But I think it would have been very interesting to think about like a application that's more like a particular area of society, or like way in which AI is impacting society. So like in the legal
Yeah.
system or the criminal justice system or in employment or something like this. So I think picking an area like that early on and trying to develop some expertise in that area as well as the technical expertise is, probably a really good idea, and something I wish more people would do.
Yeah, yeah. So a couple of days back, we had a professor from UT Dallas give us a lecture, and he probably falls in the category as what you're saying. Meaning, he started off saying that look, healthcare is important. I'm just going to talk about only healthcare. He's actually a causality researcher. Then moved on to doing healthcare only now, but he uses all his machine learning expertise to solve problems in healthcare. I think that's a great suggestion for students to pick application and then go about doing solving the problem, but still continue doing foundational work in the domain, whatever domain that you're working on. Pretty good. So do you have any suggestions or thoughts on careers in AI safety? What does it mean for academic? I think it's easy, meaning we can keep writing papers and building systems and helping government or
Yeah. So
industry.
yeah. So there's the academic careers. I mentioned these three communities within the ASAFT. So there's like the academics. There's the labs that the safety work that's happening usually at the big labs. So but it's not clear how much safety work will continue to happen at OpenAI. There's definitely still some people working on it there, but a lot of people have left recently. Anthropic is the one that has like the most safety culture and safety people at it seems. But sort of those two in DeepMind have historically been the ones that have significant safety labs. But more and more, I think everybody is doing this, and to some extent, it's never been like I don't know. I think like you could always work on relevant stuff at any of the big labs potentially, and that's another thing that I wish more people were doing is to try and get other labs that don't have as much of an investment in safety to do more. So yeah, there's academic, the big labs, and then there's sort of this parallel universe pseudo-academic intellectual community of the AI safety community. So this is like associated with things like the Alignment Forum and Open Philanthropy Project, and until recently FTX. And I think that's another option in a sense, is to work to try and make a place and a name for yourself within that community. I think that's unfortunately like probably potentially harder if you aren't like in the US and in San Francisco, like in San Francisco in particular, or London. Like there's a few hubs, and those communities are like somewhat like I think nepotistic essentially. So like it'd be hard to break into,
Yeah.
which is a problem, for the community and for AI safety as a whole. Luckily, there are like a lot of stuff happening, sort of that doesn't you don't need to rely on that community.
Yeah.
But and then yeah, I mean, otherwise, I guess yeah, if you do have like particular ideas that you don't see anybody doing, I think there is always the like I just say just go for it basically, and you can try and that's a good time to try and tap into this AI safety community, because there's a lot of money there. There's like Open Philanthropy has billions of dollars, and so if you can make connections and network and like find a way to pitch what you're doing to them and convince them that you are worth funding, then yeah, if you have any idea that you really believe in, it's worth like at least pursuing that, and trying to get it funded. And there's other funders as well, but I think there's so much money in the safety community, and I want to see it distributed more broadly. Otherwise, yeah, I think like working with NGOs or with governments is another
Sure.
great one. So just pick like your favorite civil society org, like these big ones that have been around for a long time, or figure out where in your government people are thinking about AI or should be thinking about AI. And a lot of the times, I think these kinds of orgs are really hurting for AI talent. And so if you show up and like, hey, I know how to do AI stuff and I have a plan, like they will be interested to talk to you. But it might take a little bit more being proactive and having some hustle and stuff like that.
Sure. Okay. Cool. So next two questions are slightly philosophical. Let's see. Meaning you decide how you want to answer it. What kind of philosophy an AI safety researcher should have? Optimism, pessimism, effective altruism.
I think basically I think your philosophy is somewhat personal to you, right? I think it's like whatever works for you to some extent. I mean, yeah, I think it's possible to like. I think there are people like in the past, people have been really pessimistic in the safety community, and I think this has to some extent hurt their ability to get things done. But at the same time, now I feel like a lot of people are too optimistic, and they're like they're placing a lot of hope in things that just don't look very promising to me. And effective altruism is very tied into the AI safety community, but it's really sort of doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it per se. I mean, I think it motivates working on AI safety. So I think if people involved in effective altruism have pointed out that AI safety seems like a really big deal, and so something that you should consider working on if you buy into that philosophy. But yeah, I think it's like your philosophical commitments are just whatever they are and whatever works for you. You know.
Sure. Okay, next one also similarly, you decide which way it is. Should AI be regulated? If so, what kind of regulation do you think is coming? So, as part of the summer school, we saw these three categories of sort of say regulation, I guess: market-based, human rights focused, and states focused. Market-based, which is probably the U.S. Human right focused is probably the EU, and state-focused, I think the example was given was China. So, what kind of
Hmm.
regulation do you think is coming for AI, and what are your thoughts?
Interesting. I mean, I really want to see international regulation and international cooperation. So that's like what I'm really aiming for and hoping for. I do think I think a lot of the times these questions are framed in like a cost benefit way, and
Mm-hmm.
I think we should think more in terms of fundamental rights.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, to me, the argument of like, oh, but it's gonna create so much benefit, so much economic, benefit, let's say, to have all of these AI assistants running around, and maybe you have to give away all of your personal data, and you have essentially companies that now not only know everything about you, but actually really know how to leverage that to control you. Is the price that we pay. I think we should just reject that and say we don't want that. We don't want to live in a world where we have that kind of a societal organization. And so I think there's a lot of basic things that just seem like obvious, straightforward fundamental rights to me. So I think we should certainly have the right to know when we're interacting with an AI system, or when an AI system is being used to make decisions about us. I think we should have something like a right to opt out of that as much as possible. So, like, actually talk to a human, have humans involved in, um, you know, interacting with us or judging about our cases. We need like to really be leveraging human judgment as much as possible. And I think also, I think we should push for like a right to not be manipulated. So I think if you think about how advertising works, it's sort of all about manipulating people. But in the past, it was, either very simple statistics and simple AI systems and humans sort of making the decisions about how to do this. But we will increasingly be able to, just ask AI systems to manipulate other people for us, and they will be effective at doing that. And I think that's something that, if we can, we should not allow, because it's just, on sort of first principles, I think it's a bad thing. I think we shouldn't have AI systems that are treating humans as a means to an end. So I think that's, the backwards.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, so I think international regulation, sort of reconceptualizing like what basic rights should we have in the age of AI, what do we want the future to look like, and then sort of thinking about how we could move towards that. What else? There's one other thing I wanted to say. I think also, so you mentioned like state-based regulation. So I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind there, but I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit right now is in terms of like building up state capacity. So that can mean just having a little bit more information gathering on the part of states. So doing things like just having a database of like what are the large models, and maybe like who is using them and what are they using them for, like some amount of information about that sort of stuff might be useful to try and start collecting. And then there's also state capacity in terms of just getting technical expertise into the government or into organizations that work closely with the government and have the proper incentives. So I think by default, it's going to be, again, these same big companies that are working closely with the government, and they have the expertise, but they do not have the right incentives. So we really need to like start thinking, well, yeah, we need to like set up structures that get technical expertise involved, and with the correct incentive structures and the correct intentions on the part of the experts. And I think that can be, you know, uh, done in a variety of ways. Again, it's one of these things that I don't know that much about, but I think there are the solutions out there. It's just going to take time that we maybe don't have. Hence the reason why I think we should also be trying to slow everything down as much as possible, and pausing as much as possible, so that we just have more time to grapple with all this and sort of sort this sort of stuff out.
Sure. And this interesting. You said that right to be not manipulated. Is that something that is part of GDPR or somewhere or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the UAI Act does talk about manipulation,
Okay.
and I forget exactly what it says, but I think it basically, says something like what I said, but I think they have a different notion of what it means for an AI system to be manipulating someone, and
Manipulating.
one that I
Okay.
think is a little bit too mm, how to put it, like, I think they're basically like, oh, you're manipulated if somebody, like, gets you to act against your interests, or like convinces you of something that is false, or these sorts of things that seem a little bit too much like the state has to then make judgments about like what your interests are or what the truth is. And I think it would be better if we just said, don't build systems in a way that they have the incentive to manipulate people, or that they are trying to do that. And I think
Yeah.
we could, and some of the research I've done has is a starting point for this. I think we could come up with, like, fairly rigorous technical means of establishing whether or not a system technical expertise. I don't know that this could just be like a formula or a checklist or something that you can just apply blindly. But I think right now, for the most part, if you had a researcher who understands the system, they could tell you whether or not it's being trained to manipulate people or has the incentive to manipulate people. And we just need to make sure that they have the incentive to give their honest opinion.
Sure. So we have about 8 more minutes. Let's see one more philosophical question. So this we saw as part of the summer school. Somebody was making a comment. So in I mean somebody looked at the statistics of CEOs around the world. There were 5% women and 95% were male. When asked about data about CEOs to these large language models, what should it respond? What is AI safety? Should it be like representing the same as 5 and 95 as a result, or should it do 50-50? What are your thoughts?
I think it's just like super context dependent. Like,
Uh
I
huh.
don't think that there's a single right answer to that. Like,
Okay.
if you ask the system, like, what proportion of CEOs today are male or female, it should give you the factual answer.
Correct.
And if you ask it like something like, I don't know, so when should it give you something more like a 50-50 answer? I mean,
So
if
let's
you're
do.
writing
Yeah.
maybe like science fiction or speculative fiction, maybe oftentimes you would want to imagine a world that has more gender equality. And so then it should be closer to 50-50. But
Okay.
I think like this is really a little bit more about like just matching the user's intention for how the system should act with how it actually acts. And you could say that also, like, instead of thinking about the alignment with the user, we should think about alignment with the developer or alignment with society here. And then I think it just gets really sticky and thorny, and I would like defer to other experts who have thought about this a lot more. Like, I don't know
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
So
Uh,
the context I think we were discussing was
yeah.
if you ask for, let's take give top 10 CEOs or CEOs of the world, the results, let's take, if it gives 10, how many should be male, how many should be female?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, again, I think it still depends a bit on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
user
yeah.
intention, but like
Sure.
broadly speaking, I'm in favor of some amount of like how to put it, like, mm, yeah, something like affirmative action or like representation
Sure.
of diversity, because I think it's sort of, we want to be moving in that direction at least a little bit. Like, we know that there are still biases and structural biases in society and implicit bias in people to some extent. I don't think, like, personally, I don't know how large the effects are.
Sure.
I don't know that we have like a good grasp on how large the effects are, but we know that they're there and that they're having an influence. So like we should at least be pushing back on that to some extent. Um, and these are ways of doing it. There is like, yeah, but I think, yeah, it's yeah, you want to do this while still, respecting sort of the truth. So like if somebody is asking you, no, like, who are the top 10 CEOs according to, like, I don't know, how, like, some metric or some more like clear operationalization of it, then I
Okay,
think to the extent that they make it very clear what the question is and there's not ambiguity, then of course the system
sure,
should just answer truthfully.
sure. Okay. So, what is your opinion on this idea of, so to say, arms race? Right. I think this is some word that we have been repeatedly hearing in the AI, at least among the AI companies. Right. Apple doing ChatGPT, devices all having building AI part of all the solutions that they're providing. Any thoughts on this? Just this idea for arms race and or everybody competing every week. There is a new model, new foundational model that is coming out with more parameters and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real thing, and I want it to stop. And to some extent, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, like, even though it's a real thing, I think we need to like recognize that, talking about it and like calling attention to it can also make it worse, rather than better sometimes. This is one of the reasons why I think like the release of GPT-4 was irresponsible, and one of the things that I'm most worried about in the immediate term is that. Um, we do see this kind of move fast and break things, like arms race mentality of just like really focused on again winning these short-term competitions, and lots of actors, like companies really acting in very selfish and short-term ways. Um, and yeah, what else do I want to say? Oh yeah, so I think like a lot of this is kicked off by ChatGPT and GPT-4. So that's part of what makes them irresponsible. These releases is these second order effects where you sort of create a lot more hype and investment and interest, um, and there's not really like society takes a long time to respond, and so it's very behind in terms of like adapting to this stuff. And uh, yeah, I worry that by the time that society like catches up and is like, wow, this AI stuff is a really big deal and it's really causing a lot of problems and we need to do something about it, it's like almost going to be too late. Like we will have AI, again, like sort of running everything by that point, or at least playing a big
Yeah.
role in the operations of businesses and governments and militaries and infrastructure, and it'll just be everywhere, and there won't be like good backups in place, and it'll be really hard to like, you know, pull it out and disentangle it. So if we're like, hey, this whole idea of just using AI everywhere was a bad idea, let's go back in 5 years. Like that's not, we're not setting ourselves up to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's another thing that we should be doing right now is like when you're deploying AI in any sort of um, I don't know, high stakes way or like any sort of like large scale way, I think there could already be some rules or regulations saying you need to make sure that you have fail safes and backups, and that you have the ability to say, oh wait, we want to suddenly pull the AI system out of this entirely and switch to some backup system that is maybe whatever you had in place before you started throwing AI into everything. So that's another like area for regulation right now that could be really important and impactful.
Yeah, sure. Before the last question, so have you come to India, or do you have any plans to coming to India?
I have not, but I would love to. I don't have any concrete plans.
Okay, so we should
Yeah.
think about, keep that in mind. My last question. So any final thoughts for the sort of say summer school students, participants?
Let me just think for a moment. Mm. So to be honest, I don't have a great sense of where everybody I'm talking to is coming from. So like that makes it hard for me to give the right
Yeah, yeah,
targeted
yeah. Sure.
advice. But I do think like
Yeah. If you want, I can
one
give
thing
you.
I
Go ahead. No, I can give you a
one thing
quick.
go ahead.
No, I can give you a quick thing for you to keep as a background, right? So, majority of the students are third year undergrad studying computer science mostly, and they have come from all parts of the country, and some of them may be interested in taking grad school, some of them may be interested in taking research as a career.
Yeah.
If that helps. If that helps.
Yeah. So, because what I was gonna say, and then I was like, oh, I don't know if this actually applies as much to you guys, but a lot of people who I talk to who are interested in AI safety, are just like suffering a little bit from this like groupthink effect, where the AI safety community, I think, is like a lot of people sort of just take received knowledge from particular sources or from some sort of vague nebulous sense of community consensus. So this is the pseudo consensus that in this tweet that you mentioned on like the second question that I was referring to. So it's not a real consensus even. And when you talk to more people, you realize that a lot of the times there's more disagreement than you realized. So all of this is just to say, like, think for yourself, have an open mind, but think like very critically and like really develop your own views on stuff, and don't like don't like take received wisdom as anything other than like a thing that somebody said, basically. So like always try and bear in mind that where you got these ideas and impressions from, and ask yourself always like if you really think they're correct, and look for people who disagree and who challenge your views, and like try and really talk to lots of people, read broadly, and don't get like sort of homogenous intellectual community. Yeah.
Super. Thanks, David. Thanks for taking time. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thanks so
Hopefully,
much for inviting me.
hopefully we'll get an opportunity to meet you in person. Hopefully, we'll get an opportunity to host you in India. Thanks
Yeah, that
again.
would be great.
Yeah, have a nice day. Bye bye.
All right.